Rise, my apprentice.
Obi Wan Kenobi stood amidst the mourners, his heart heavy with the weight of the loss. The Jedi funeral cast long, flickering shadows as flames consumed the remains of his fallen master, Qui-Gon Jinn. Obi-Wan's thoughts were a whirlwind, torn between grief, duty, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. Anakin Skywalker, the boy Qui-Gon had believed to be the chosen one, awaited his fate on Coruscant. Obi-Wan was to return to the Jedi Temple the next day, where the council would decide if he was ready to take Anakin as his Padawan. Yet, despite his promise to his dying master, Obi-Wan knew he was not mentally prepared for such a responsibility. The loss of Qui-Gon had left a void in his heart that he could not easily fill. He needed clarity, a way to find peace with his emotions before he could consider guiding the young Skywalker. As the flames danced, Obi-Wan made a decision. Quietly, he slipped away from the gathered Jedi, unnoticed in the shadows of the night. His destination was a place that had always brought him solace, a place far removed from the political machinations of the Republic and the duties of a Jedi, Mandalore. The thought of seeing Satine, the woman who had once captured his heart, drew him forward. He believed that only on Mandalore could he find the peace and clarity he so desperately needed. Arriving on Mandalore, Obi-Wan felt a wave of nostalgia. The last time he had been here, he was a young Padawan, under the watchful eye of Qui-Gon Jinn. The mission had been simple: protect Duchess Satine Kryze from insurgents who sought to destabilize her newly established rule. But what was supposed to be a straightforward assignment had turned into something much more complex. Over the course of a year, while navigating the dangers and political intrigue of Mandalore, Obi-Wan and Satine had grown close, their bond deepening into a love that neither could fully acknowledge at the time. Now, years later, Obi-Wan found himself drawn back to her, seeking the comfort and counsel of the one person who understood the weight of his burdens. As he approached the royal palace, memories flooded his mind of the time he spent protecting her, of the moments they shared, and of the deep connection they had forged amidst the chaos. Satine welcomed him with open arms, her serene presence a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. They spoke in private, away from the prying eyes of the court. Obi-Wan confided in her the depth of his grief, his anger at the Jedi Council for not heeding Qui-Gon's warnings about the growing darkness. He voiced his doubts about the Jedi Order's true purpose, whether they were still peacekeepers of the galaxy or had become mere servants of the Republic's increasingly flawed government. Satine listened intently, her gaze filled with empathy and understanding. She too had her own reservations about the Republic and the Jedi's role within it.
The Jedi and the Republic,
she said softly,
have become one and the same, losing their way in the pursuit of power and control. Perhaps it is time for a different path, Obi-Wan.
She offered him a position by her side, a chance to remain neutral, away from the conflicts tearing the galaxy apart. She spoke of a place where he could rediscover his connection to the Force, unburdened by the politics and dogma of the Jedi Order. It was a place where he could find the light that had been lost, both within himself and within the galaxy. Obi-Wan was tempted, the offer resonating deeply with his current state of mind. Obi-Wan sat in contemplation, the weight of Satine's offer pressing heavily on his mind. He appreciated her words, her understanding, and the possibility of a new path. Yet, deep within, there was a resistance, a voice that urged him to reconsider. The thought of leaving the Jedi Order, of abandoning the life he had dedicated himself to, seemed almost impossible. He thought of Qui-Gon Jinn, the man who had been more than just a mentor. Qui-Gon had been like a father figure to him, guiding him through the trials and tribulations of Jedi life. What would Qui-Gon say if he knew Obi-Wan was considering walking away from the Order? Obi-Wan could almost hear his master's voice, urging him to stay true to the path of the Jedi. Qui-Gon had always believed in the living Force, and following one's instincts, but he also believed in the importance of the Jedi as guardians of peace. Would Qui-Gon see Obi-Wan's doubts as a test, one that he needed to overcome by staying with the Order? Then there was Anakin Skywalker, the boy who had been thrust into his care by Qui-Gon's dying wish. The possibility that Anakin was the chosen one weighed heavily on Obi-Wan's mind. Anakin needed guidance, training, and a steady hand to help him navigate the challenges ahead. Obi-Wan knew he had a responsibility to Anakin, to the Jedi, and to the galaxy. Perhaps it was time for him to return to Coruscant, to fulfill the promise he made to his master and to the Jedi Council. The thought of leaving the Jedi Order now felt like a betrayal, not just to Qui-Gon, but to Anakin, who had placed his trust in Obi-Wan. The very idea of abandoning the young Padawan filled Obi-Wan with guilt. He had a duty, a mission that needed to be completed. Perhaps Satine was right about the Republic and the Jedi losing their way, but could Obi-Wan really turn his back on everything he had known, on the responsibility he had been given? That night, as the quiet Mandalore enveloped him, Obi-Wan retired to his private quarters, still wrestling with the choices before him. The solitude of that evening did little to calm his turbulent thoughts. He longed for guidance, for a sign that would make the path ahead clearer. As he sat in meditation, attempting to find peace, a sudden and familiar presence filled the room. Startled, Obi-Wan opened his eyes to find the ethereal form of his master, Qui-Gon Jinn, standing before him. Obi-Wan's breath caught in his throat. How was this possible? He had seen Qui-Gon die, had felt the life leave his body, and yet here he stood, radiating a calm, otherworldly light.
Master?
Obi-Wan's voice trembled with disbelief. Qui-Gon smiled gently, his eyes filled with the same warmth and wisdom that Obi-Wan remembered.
Yes, my old friend, it is me.
But how are you here?
I have learned to exist beyond death. The Force has granted me the ability to return, to guide those who need it most.
Obi-Wan was overwhelmed, the reality of this encounter shaking him to his core. But more than the miracle of his master's presence, it was the message Qui-Gon carried that would change everything.
Obi-Wan, I have come to tell you to listen to your heart. The path ahead is not easy, but you must trust in yourself. Stay here, on Mandalore, with Satine.
But Master, what about the Jedi?
The Jedi are on a path of destruction, one that cannot be averted by your presence alone. The galaxy is changing, and the Force is guiding you toward a different destiny. Your place is here, on Mandalore. In time, your presence here will bring hope, not only to the Jedi, but to the entire galaxy.
Obi-Wan felt a deep conflict within him. His duty to the Jedi weighed heavily on one side, while Qui-Gon's words and the pull of his heart towards Satine tugged at the other. Could he truly abandon the Order, turn away from everything he had ever known, based on the counsel of a spirit?
Trust in the Force, Obi-Wan. It will guide you as it always has. But know this, your choice here will echo through the future, bringing light where darkness seeks to consume all. Stay true to who you are, and all will be well.
With that, Qui-Gon's presence dissipated, leaving Obi-Wan alone once more. Yet, here he was, no longer the same. His master's words had ignited a spark within him, a realization that perhaps the path he had always followed was not the only way forward. As the night wore on, Obi-Wan laid awake, his thoughts no longer consumed by doubt, but by the possibilities of what might come if he chose to stay. The next morning, as the sun rose over the Mandalorian skyline, Obi-Wan felt a renewed sense of clarity. The words of his late master echoed in his mind, guiding him toward a decision that had once seemed impossible. With a deep breath, he prepared himself for what he knew he must do. Obi-Wan sought out Satine, finding her in the palace gardens where the early light bathed everything in a soft golden glow. As they met, the unspoken understanding between them deepened. Obi-Wan's heart ached with the weight of his choice he was about to make, but also with the hope that it would lead to something greater. He conveyed his decision to stay with her through his demeanor and actions, his resolve clear and unwavering. Satine, though surprised, accepted his decision with a mix of relief and concern, knowing the magnitude of what this meant for both of them. There was a shared understanding that they would face whatever came together, their bond stronger for the choice Obi-Wan had made. With this decision made, Obi-Wan knew it was time to make a final farewell. He retreated to a quiet room within the palace, activating his communicator to contact the Jedi Council. As the familiar faces of the council members appeared before him, he silently conveyed his resignation, the weight of his decision heavy but resolute. The council's reaction was a mix of shock, disappointment, and a deep sense of loss. Obi-Wan knew this was not what they wanted to hear, but it was the truth he had come to accept. He bowed his head in a final respect, acknowledging the severance of his ties with the Jedi Order. With the communicator deactivated, Obi-Wan felt the silence that followed to be profound. But for the first time in a long while, he experienced a sense of peace with his decision. Returning to Satine, he felt a sense of purpose and clarity. Together, they would face whatever the future held, bound by a shared vision of a better galaxy, one where hope could still flourish, even in the face of darkness. Over the next decade, Obi Wan and Satine embarked on a life together that was both fulfilling and challenging. Their union was blessed with the birth of 2 children, a son and a daughter, who brought joy and a sense of purpose to their lives. Yet, the path they chose was fraught with difficulties. Mandalore, a society with a rich history of warrior culture, was not easily swayed by the idea of a Jedi outsider holding such influence, even if he was married to their Duchess. Many Mandalorians viewed Obi-Wan with suspicion, questioning his motives and his true allegiance. The once united people began to argue and grow divided, the strain of an outsider in power exacerbating existing tensions. Nevertheless, Obi-Wan and Satine worked tirelessly to maintain Mandalore's pacifist stance and keep their people united. They believed in the ideals of peace and neutrality, striving to uphold these values even as the galaxy around them descended into chaos. When the Clone Wars erupted, the pressure of Mandalore intensified. As the conflict spread, many Mandalorians grew concerned that their planet would be dragged into the war, especially with Obi-Wan's history as a Jedi and a peacekeeper of the galaxy. The cries for help from worlds caught in the crossfire weighed heavily on Obi-Wan's conscience. His innate sense of duty as a protector and a guardian made it difficult for him to remain passive, but Satine and the core principles of Mandalore's neutrality kept him anchored. However, the growing unrest among the people could not be ignored. Many began to fear that Obi-Wan's presence would inevitably draw Mandalore into the war. The populace, already uneasy with Satine's pacifist policies, started to question whether these ideals were leaving Mandalore vulnerable. The tensions between the desire to remain neutral and the fear of being perceived as weak created a deep rift among the people. As the Clone Wars worsened, so too did the divide on Mandalore. Satine's commitment to pacifism was increasingly seen as a liability rather than a strength. The people, anxious and fearful for their future, began to voice their doubts more openly, challenging the leadership of both Satine and Obi-Wan. The once stable foundation of their rule began to show cracks as the threat of war loomed ever closer and the pressures from within their own society grew harder to manage. As the conflict within Mandalore deepened, an even darker threat loomed on the horizon. Maul, once a Sith apprentice and now a figure of malevolent ambition, had formed a criminal syndicate known as the Shadow Collective. This powerful alliance brought together some of the galaxy's most notorious crime organizations, including the Pike Syndicate, the Black Sun, and the Hutt Cartel. But Maul's ambitions did not stop there. He sought to gain control over Mandalore itself, seeing it as a key to expanding his power. To achieve this, Maul formed an alliance with Death Watch, a militant faction of Mandalorians who opposed Duchess Satine and Obi-Wan's pacifist rule. Death Watch, led by the ruthless Pre Vizsla, believed that Mandalore's warrior roots had been eroded by the pacifist policies, and they saw the current leadership as a betrayal of their proud heritage. For them, Maul represented an opportunity to restore Mandalore's strength and dominance. Maul and Pre Vizsla struck a deadly bargain. Maul would help Death Watch overthrow Satine and Obi-Wan, and in return, Maul would take control of Mandalore. The alliance of convenience was built on mutual benefit, but both parties harbored their own hidden agendas. Death Watch saw Maul as a means to an end, intending to use his power and influence to seize control before eventually discarding him. Maul, however, had no intentions of being a mere pawn. He saw Mandalore as the perfect platform for which to launch his own rise to power, and he was willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. As the Shadow Collective's influence spread, Mandalore was plunged into a new level of turmoil. The once subtle division within Mandalorian society became violent rifts, fueled by Death Watch's aggressive campaign against the ruling government. Rumors of Maul's involvement and his dark intentions began to circulate, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Satine and Obi-Wan, despite their best efforts to maintain peace, found themselves increasingly isolated. One day, Obi-Wan and his family were gathered in the throne room, the heart of Mandalore's power, when the doors suddenly burst open. The familiar clank of Mandalorian armor echoed through the chambers as Death Watch, led by Maul, stormed in. The sight of Maul, a figure Obi-Wan believed to be long dead, struck him like a physical blow. Memories of his master's death surged back, along with the rage and pain he had worked so hard to bury. But in that crucial moment, Obi-Wan took a deep breath. centering himself. Now was not the time to be consumed by the past. His family's safety was all that mattered. Maul, exuding a dark and menacing presence, demanded that Obi Wan and Satine step down. He claimed that the people of Mandalore were tired of their perceived weakness and that a new era was at hand. It was clear to Obi Wan that regardless of their decision, this confrontation would not end peacefully. Among the Death Watch members was Bo-Katan, who had aligned herself with the faction but now realized the extent of Maul's treachery. She had been promised that her family would be spared, but it was becoming evident that Maul had no intentions of honoring that agreement. Disgusted by Maul's ruthlessness, Bo-Katan, along with a few loyal Mandalorians, broke away from Death Watch, choosing to fight alongside Obi Wan instead. The throne room erupted into chaos as an all-out battle ensued. Obi Wan's children, who had been trained in the ways of the Force, quickly understood the gravity of the situation. They acted decisively, guiding their mother to safety, while Obi Wan and a handful of loyal Mandalorians engaged in combat. The room filled with the sound of blasters, clashing blades, and the hum of lightsabers, the air thick with tension and danger. Despite their valiant efforts, it became apparent that Maul and his forces had the upper hand. The relentless attacks from Death Watch, combined with Maul's ferocious prowess, forced Obi Wan and his allies into a desperate situation. The loyalists were gradually overwhelmed, and Obi Wan found himself outnumbered and cornered. Realizing that continuing the fight would only lead to needless death, Obi Wan made the difficult decision to retreat. As he fought his way out of the throne room, Obi Wan's mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. Mandalore had fallen into the hands of a Sith and his criminal syndicate, and his family was now in grave danger. The battle for Mandalore was far from over, but for now, Obi-Wan's priority was to ensure the safety of his loved ones and regroup for the fight that lay ahead. Obi-Wan, Satine, and their children fled Mandalore with heavy hearts, leaving behind the world they had fought so hard to protect. The loss was profound. Everything they had built, every effort to maintain peace, had been shattered in a single brutal coup. The once proud family now found themselves as exiles, stripped of their power and forced to abandon their home. Their escape led them to a distant, uncharted world, far from the reaches of Maul and his forces. This remote planet, untouched by the chaos of the Clone Wars, would serve as their refuge for the time being. Yet the move was a bitter one. The realization that Mandalore, the planet they had devoted their lives to, had turned against them, weighed heavily on each of them. The betrayal by their own people was a wound that cut deep, leaving them demoralized and uncertain of the future. The years that followed were marked by constant movement and caution for Obi-Wan, Satine, and their children. They lived as nomads, always on the move, never staying in one place for too long. The galaxy had changed dramatically. The Clone Wars had ended, giving rise to the Galactic Empire, and with it, the extinction of the Jedi Order. The dark shadow of the Empire spread across the stars, its reach seemingly infinite. Maul, the architect of their downfall on Mandalore, had met his end at the hands of the Emperor, who saw him as a potential rival. With Maul's death, the criminal networks he had built began to fracture, but the Empire's power only grew stronger. As the galaxy fell deeper under the Imperial control, the once great civilizations were either subjugated or obliterated. Among the targets of the Empire's wrath was Mandalore. Recognized as a potential threat, the planet was marked for conquest. The first real assault by Imperial forces on Mandalore was brutal, designed to crush any remaining resistance and bring the warrior culture fully under Imperial rule. Word of this assault reached Satine and Obi Wan through a desperate message from Bo-Katan, who had survived the chaos over the past years and was now leading what remained of the Mandalorian resistance. Bo-Katan's plea was simple: Mandalore needed their help. The time for hiding was over. Satine and Obi Wan, along with their children, now young adults, strong in the Force, and eager to make a difference, could no longer stand by and watch as their home was destroyed. They had spent years in the shadows, but the call to action was one they could not ignore. The galaxy had changed, but the resolve to protect the innocent and fight for justice had not. Obi-Wan, Satine, and their children joined the fight on Mandalore, their presence reinvigorating the resistance. With their help, Mandalore became a formidable opponent against the Empire's assault. The people, inspired by the return of their leaders and strength of their young warriors, rallied together to push back against the Imperial forces. However, the tide of battle would soon shift as word of the resistance strength reached the ears of Darth Vader. Vader, Palpatine's apprentice, was not encased in the suit that had become synonymous with his name. In this timeline, he was still the powerful yet twisted version of Anakin Skywalker. His hatred for Obi Wan had festered over the years, fueled by the belief that Obi Wan had abandoned him when he needed him most, when Qui-Gon died. In Vader's eyes, Obi Wan had failed him, leaving him to be molded into the Sith he had become under Palpatine's influence. Vader's arrival on Mandalore was like the calm before a storm. The battle that followed was fierce, with Obi Wan and his children confronting Vader in a duel that would determine the fate of their home. The clash of lightsabers illuminated the darkness of the battlefield, each strike charged with the weight of their shared history. Tragedy struck when Vader, in a moment of overwhelming power, struck down Obi-Wan's son. The young warrior, who had fought bravely alongside his father, fell to the ground, his life extinguished in an instant. Obi-Wan's heart shattered, but years of Jedi training allowed him to push aside his grief, focusing instead on the fight at hand. He could not afford to lose himself in sorrow, not while his daughter was still fighting by his side. However, Vader's power was immense. Soon, Obi-Wan's daughter was disarmed, literally by Vader's ruthless strike, her arm severed as she crumpled to the ground, alive but unable to continue the fight. Now it was just Obi-Wan and Vader, locked in a desperate struggle. Obi-Wan, worn and battered, could see the arrogance in every move from Vader. Anakin's immense power had made him overconfident, leading him to underestimate Obi-Wan. Drawing on every ounce of his experience, Obi-Wan devised a plan. He feigned defeat, allowing Vader to believe he had won, only to strike at the perfect moment. His calculated blow landed true, sending Vader crashing to the ground in pain. But just as Obi-Wan moved to deliver the final strike, the sound of Imperial reinforcements filled the air. The Empire's support had arrived, and in the chaos that ensued, they managed to rescue the fallen Vader, whisking him away before Obi-Wan could finish the battle. Exhausted and broken, Obi-Wan could only watch as the Imperial ships disappeared into the sky, taking the former Jedi with them. Mandalore had been spared for now, but the cost had been immense. The loss of his son, the grievous injury to his daughter weighed heavily on Obi-Wan, yet there was a glimmer of hope. The people of Mandalore witnessed the power of resistance, and the fight for their home was far from over. Obi-Wan, Satine, and the remaining family would regroup, heal, and prepare for the battles yet to come. The war was not over, and neither was their resolve. Mandalore stood resilient, its defenses bolstered by the leadership of Obi-Wan and Satine. The battle had been grueling, but the Mandalorian people had proven their strength and determination. The Empire, despite its overwhelming power, had been pushed back, and Mandalore had shown that it would not be easily conquered. The people, once divided, now rallied around their leaders, recognizing the courage and sacrifice Obi-Wan and Satine had displayed. Through their efforts, they had earned the respect and loyalty of their citizens, uniting Mandalore under a common cause. But Obi-Wan was not fooled by this temporary victory. He knew the Empire's might, and he understood that their current victory was only for a moment. The Empire would return, and when it did, it would bring a force that Mandalore could not hope to repel on its own. The inevitability of the coming storm weighed heavily on him, driving him to consider the long-term survival of Mandalore and its people. It was during this time of uncertain peace that Obi-Wan was contacted by a senator, Bail Organa. Bail had been watching the events on Mandalore with great interest, and he was impressed by how the planet had managed to stave off the Empire's assault. Recognizing the potential strength of Mandalore as an ally, Bail extended an offer to Obi-Wan and Satine to join the nascent rebellion that was quietly gathering strength across the galaxy. The offer came with promise of mutual support. Although the rebellion was not yet ready to launch a full-scale assault on the Empire, it was growing steadily. Bail believed that with Mandalore's resources, warriors, and strategic position, they could significantly bolster the rebellion's efforts. In return, the rebellion could provide Mandalore with additional resources, intelligence, and a small but growing fleet that could help protect the planet from the future Imperial attack. Obi-Wan and Satine deliberated carefully over the offer. The decision to join the rebellion was not one to be taken lightly, as it would place Mandalore in direct opposition to the Empire. However, the reality was clear. Without allies, Mandalore would eventually fail. The Empire's relentless pursuit of control left no room for neutrality or independence. The time had come to choose a side. After much consideration and discussion with their trusted advisors and leaders, Obi-Wan and Satine decided that joining the rebellion was the best course of action for Mandalore's future. They knew the risk, but they also understood the potential for a greater good, a galaxy free from the tyranny of the Empire. Before the Empire could marshal its forces for a return to Mandalore, a seismic shift in leadership occurred within its ranks. Anakin Skywalker, now fully consumed by the dark side and known as Darth Vader, found himself on the receiving end of his master's wrath. Palpatine, displeased with Vader's failure to crush Mandalore and eliminate Obi Wan, harshly reprimanded him. Seething with disappointment, the reprimand struck a deep nerve in Vader, whose anger had been simmering ever since the loss of Padme, a loss he blamed on Palpatine's manipulations as much as on himself. The confrontation became the catalyst for a dramatic and violent change, fueled by his deep-seated hatred and desire to reclaim autonomy. Vader confronted Palpatine in a confrontation that shook the very foundations of the Empire. The battle was fierce, but Anakin, now at the peak of his dark powers, finally overpowered his master. In a decisive and brutal act, Anakin killed Palpatine, seizing control of the Empire for himself. With Palpatine dead, Anakin's transformation was complete. He no longer saw himself as merely a servant of the dark side. He was now the Emperor, the undisputed ruler of the galaxy. The pain of losing Padme, compounded by the years of servitude under Palpatine, had twisted Anakin's vision of the future. He was now determined to reshape the galaxy in his image, creating an empire that would stand unchallenged, where his children, Luke and Leia, would one day rule by his side. In this timeline, Luke and Leia were still young, unaware of the full extent of their father's ambitions. Anakin, however, was resolute in his plans. He believed that his children were destined to join him in his quest for absolute power, and he envisioned a future where the Skywalker family would reign supreme over the galaxy. For now, they were too young to understand, but Anakin was certain that soon, they would be ready to embrace their destiny. As the new emperor, Anakin moved swiftly to consolidate his power, ruthlessly eliminating any remnants of opposition within the Empire and ensuring that his authority was unquestioned. His next objective was clear: Mandalore, the world that had defied him and his former master, would be brought to heel. But this time, Anakin would not rely on overwhelming military might alone. He would personally lead the charge, driven by a desire to prove his dominance and crush any who stood in his way. Anakin Skywalker, now the Emperor, returned to Mandalore with the full might of the Empire at his command. This time, he was determined to crush the planet that had defied him, to assert his dominance and cement his rule over the galaxy. The Imperial fleet, vast and formidable, descended upon Mandalore with the expectation of a swift and decisive victory. But once again, Anakin had underestimated the people of Mandalore. During this time, since their last encounter, Obi Wan, Satine, and the Mandalorian resistance had been far from idle. They had forged alliances, bolstered their defenses, and amassed a fleet of their own. The rebellion had grown stronger, and with Mandalore as a critical stronghold, they were prepared to face the Empire head-on. As the Imperial fleet entered the Mandalorian space, they were met with fierce resistance. The space battle that ensued was nothing short of epic. With ships clashing in the cold void above the planet, the Mandalorian fleet, though smaller, was agile and strategically positioned, catching the Empire off guard. Blasts of laser fire lit up the darkness as ships from both sides were torn apart, and the battle quickly spread to the surface below. On the ground, the Mandalorian warriors, alongside the rebellion forces, fought with a ferocity born of their desire to protect their home. Obi Wan, leading the charge, was once again face to face with Anakin. The two engaged in a duel that shook the very foundations of Mandalore, the clash of their lightsabers echoing the deep conflict between them. Despite his immense power, Anakin found himself overwhelmed by the sheer determination and unity of the Mandalorian people and their allies. The battle was hard fought, with losses on both sides, but as the fight wore on, it became clear that Anakin's arrogance had once again blinded him to the strength of his opponents. In a final desperate confrontation, Anakin was struck down by Obi Wan, ending his reign of terror. As Anakin fell, the weight of his choices and the destruction he had wrought became evident in his last moments, the dark legacy of the Skywalker name seemingly reaching its tragic conclusion. With Anakin's death, the Empire was thrown into chaos. Leaderless and demoralized, the once unified forces of the Empire began to fracture, with power struggles and infighting breaking out among the remaining commanders. The rebellion, seizing the opportunity, pressed their advantage, launching a series of successful strikes that hastened the Empire's collapse. The galaxy, long oppressed under the shadow of the Empire, began to see the dawn of a new era. The rebellion's victory marked the end of Imperial rule, and planets across the galaxy celebrated their newfound freedom. However, Even in this moment of triumph, a dark shadow loomed over the victory. As the Empire crumbled, a small group of loyalists, unwilling to accept defeat, enacted a desperate plan. In the chaos of the Empire's collapse, they kidnapped Luke and Leia, Anakin's children, spiriting them away to the unknown regions. Their goal was simple: to preserve the legacy of the Skywalkers and one day return to reclaim the galaxy.